Hi, it's Mr. Bennett. In this video, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the different groups of cells, and we're going to talk about the different parts of cells, or the organelles, and what each of those parts do. Now, if I ask you to put all cells into one or two groups, depending on what your middle school teacher taught you, you may put them into the groups plant cells and animal cells, and you're wrong. The two main groups that all cells fit into are prokaryote cells and eukaryote cells, period. Every cell on the planet is one of these two things. Now, prokaryote cells are all bacteria, very small, very simple cells with just a few parts to them. Really, all prokaryotes have is a cell membrane, a cell wall, and ribosomes, and then some DNA floating around. That's it. Eukaryote cells are bigger and far more complex. This picture doesn't do it the justice, but your average eukaryote cell is about 10 times the size of your average prokaryote cell. Now, within the eukaryote cells, there are three different groups. You have your animal cells, your plant cells, and your fungi cell, or your fungus cells. So all animal, all plant, and all fungus cells are eukaryotes. They all belong in the same group. And a eukaryote cell, quite simply, is any cell that has a nucleus. That's one thing prokaryotes don't have. They do not have a nucleus. All eukaryote cells have a nucleus. So the two main groups of cells we're going to talk about are prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And then we'll also talk a little bit about each of the groups of the eukaryotes, the animal cells, the plant cells, and the fungi cells. Now, prokaryotes and eukaryotes have some important differences and they have some important similarities. If you look at them, that there are some things that they definitely have different from each other, but more importantly, there's some things that they have in common. Both prokaryotes and eukaryotes are a type of cell. Both prokaryotes and eukaryotes have a cell membrane, and both prokaryotes and eukaryotes have ribosomes. So that's an important thing to keep in mind here, is that all cells have a cell membrane, all cells have ribosomes. No questions asked. Now, eukaryotes have some stuff that prokaryotes don't have, things like nucleus, various organelles, and then linear DNA. Prokaryotes have some things that eukaryotes don't. But for the purpose of this class, what we're going to talk about is we're going to be talking about these organelles down here: cell wall, cell membrane, ribosomes, nucleus, nucleolus, nuclear envelope, rough and smooth endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi body, mitochondria, chloroplast, vacuole, lysosome, and cytoskeleton. You will have to know the function of each of those things, each of those organelles. Now, the ones that are in red, these are ones that are found in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Both prokaryotes and eukaryotes have cell walls. Both prokaryotes and eukaryotes have a cell membrane, and both prokaryotes and eukaryotes have ribosomes. The ones that are in blue, these are organelles that you only find in eukaryotes. You do not find any of these in blue in prokaryotes. And this is one of the big differences between a prokaryote and a eukaryote, is all types of cells have the things in red, but only eukaryote cells have the things that are in blue. Alright, so let's talk about the different parts of the cell, or organelles of the cell, and their function. I'm going to start from the outside and I'm going to work my way in. So the very first one we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the cell wall. In some cells, not all cells have a cell wall, but in some cells the outermost layer is called the cell wall. And what the cell wall does is it supports the cell, it gives it strength and holds it together, and it protects the cell from damage. So when we're talking about supporting the cell, we're talking about structural support. These are like the walls that hold the cell together. That if you look at these are onion cells. And you can see that they're all pretty much the same shape. They're a square or a rectangle. And the reason why they all have the same shape is because each of these cells has a cell wall, and those cells' walls are going to hold the cell together in a very rigid shape. And so the strength of all plants, like wood and so forth, all comes from the cell walls. A tree doesn't have bones, but it does have cells that have cell walls that allow it to stand up. Other thing that cell wall does is it prevents water loss. Here what you're looking at is you're looking at some cells that have been soaked in salt water. And what's happened because they've been soaked in salt water is water has left the cell. So this green thing you can see right here, that's the cell, and then this clear rectangle outside of it, that's the cell wall. Now, plant cells and cells that have a cell wall, they can dry out, but they dry out much, much slower than cells that do not have a cell wall, because the cell wall prevents water loss. Last thing you need to know about the cell wall is only certain types of cells have them. All plants have a cell wall, and all fungus have a cell wall. So all mushrooms, all molds, all mildews, every plant you've ever seen has a cell wall. No animals have a cell wall, period. End of discussion. No animal cells have a cell wall because cell walls are not flexible. If you had cell walls, you couldn't do stuff like this because the cells would be so rigid they wouldn't allow you to move. Now, some prokaryotes, bacteria, actually have cell walls, not all of them. Here you're looking at microscope pictures of bacteria. The ones on the left, these purple ones here, these guys have a cell wall. These red ones over here do not have a cell wall. So the groups of cells that have a cell wall is all plants, all fungus, and some bacteria. Now, just inside of the cell wall is something you're going to find that's called the cell membrane, or if you go to college, quite often the term that's used is plasma membrane. Now, not every cell has a cell wall, but every cell has a cell membrane. What the cell membrane is I like to think of the cell membrane as like being the bouncer of a club. A bouncer of a club decides who gets in, who gets out. This is like the security guard, whatever. That's what the cell membrane does for the cell. Here you're looking at a zoomed in electron microscope picture of a cell membrane. Here's the inside of the cell, here's the outside of the cell, here's the cell membrane right here. And what the cell membrane is there to do is it regulates what can come in and what can go out of the cell. So the cell membrane lets some stuff in, it lets some, but it keeps other things from getting in. It lets some stuff out, but prevents other stuff from leaving. The term we use for that is semi-permeable. And so the cell membrane is semi-permeable. Some things it lets in, like oxygen and water. Other things it does, and some things it lets out, like carbon dioxide. Some things it doesn't let in, like viruses and bacteria and so forth, that you're trying to keep out. So the role of the cell membrane is it controls what comes in and out of the cell. Now, the next three parts of the cell we're going to talk about are all related to each other, and they all have to do with the nucleus. Now, when you look at a cell under a microscope, the easiest part of the cell to see is going to be the nucleus. And what you're looking at here is this is a section of liver cells. All of these are liver cells, and you see these little circles in here. You may think those are the cells. You'd be wrong if you did. In each one of these little circles here, this is the nucleus of a cell. So like here would be the cell, and then in the center of it is the nucleus. Now, your middle school teacher may have taught you that the function of the nucleus is it controls the cell. That's a gross oversimplification. The main function of the nucleus is what it does is this is where the DNA is stored. Each one of your cells has 6 feet of DNA. If you stretch all the DNA in one cell out, it's going to be 6 feet long. And it's all going to be stored in the nucleus. Now, the reason why people say that the nucleus controls the cell is because the DNA is really what controls the cell. Everything your body does is controlled by the DNA that you have. And so the DNA that's inside the nucleus is what's going to control the cell, and that's why they say the nucleus controls the cell. Well, really, it's the DNA that controls the cell, and it's just kept safe inside the nucleus. Why do we need to store our DNA? Because if something messes up your DNA, you get sick, and we got a name for that. That's called cancer. That all cancers are caused by something messing up the DNA, and so we keep the DNA inside the nucleus so we can keep it safe, so nothing bad happens to it. Now, what keeps things from getting in and harming the DNA is something that we call the nuclear envelope or the nuclear membrane. The nucleus is so important, it has its own barrier. Every cell has a cell membrane that controls what gets in and out of the cell, but every nucleus also has its own second membrane that controls what gets inside, in, and out of the nucleus. So the function of the nuclear envelope is it controls what gets in and out of the nucleus. This zoomed in picture of a nucleus you're looking at right here, this is the nuclear envelope on the outside. So this whole thing here is the nucleus. This layer on the outside, that's the nuclear envelope, and that's going to control what gets in and out of the nucleus. Now, the next function part of the nucleus we need to talk about is we need to talk about the nucleolus. If you look at each of these nucleus here, of these liver cells, you may notice that a lot of them have a little dot right inside of them. That little dot, that is the nucleolus. If you look at this picture of the nucleus right here, this dot right here is the nucleolus. Now, the nucleolus is a place where lots of DNA is being used. These white areas out here, not very much DNA is being used there. But this dark spot right here, they're using DNA like crazy right there. And so the nucleolus is a place where DNA is being used. We call that transcription. So it's an area where lots of DNA is being used. And then the other thing about the nucleolus is this is a spot where ribosomes are made. And we'll talk about ribosomes in a second. So nucleus stores the DNA, nuclear envelope right here. This controls what goes in and out of the nucleus. And then the nucleolus, place where lots of DNA is being used and ribosomes are being made. So since I told you that ribosomes are made in the nucleolus, we better talk about what ribosomes are and what they do. Now, as a reminder, ribosomes are one of the organelles that are found in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Both prokaryotes and eukaryotes have cell walls, cell membranes, and ribosomes. Every cell on the planet has a ribosome, because what the ribosome does is the ribosome's job is to make proteins. That I taught you way back in one of our second unit that all proteins are made of amino acids that are bound together. Well, the things that put those amino acids together are the ribosomes. This picture you're looking at here, this is actually a string of ribosomes. Each one of these black spots right here is a ribosome that is making a protein. So every protein in your body, from your hair to your fingernails to your skin, whatever, they are all made by ribosomes. And ribosomes make proteins by putting amino acids together, and all cells have ribosomes. Now, one thing about ribosomes that's kind of interesting, ribosomes are made out of RNA. That's just a little bit of trivia to throw out for you. And the other thing about ribosomes is in a eukaryote cell, this is only in a eukaryote cell, you can find ribosomes in two places. You can find them in two places in the cell. The first place you can find them is attached to an organelle that's called the rough endoplasmic reticulum. This picture over here shows that. This yellowish green thing here is the rough ER, and these little red dots, those are the ribosomes. So some of the ribosomes inside your cells are attached to the rough endoplasmic reticulum. You can see that in this picture over here too. Here you can see the rough ER, here you can see the ribosomes attached to it. The other place that you can find ribosomes is they're just floating around in the cytoplasm. They're just floating around in the cytoplasm. And the cytoplasm is the space inside the cell that's between the cell membrane and the nucleus. So you have a cell, and inside that cell you have a lot of space, and inside those spaces you're going to find all your organelles. The parts of the cell that do not have any organelles in them, we call that the cytoplasm. And what we find there is kind of this jelly-like substance. Well, you find ribosomes just floating around in the cell, floating around in the cytoplasm. So that's the ribosome. Makes proteins. All cells have them. You can find them in two places, attached to the rough ER and also floating in the cytoplasm. All right, so since we talked about the rough endoplasmic reticulum, when we're talking about ribosomes, I better tell you what the rough ER does. If you look at a cell, what you'll find is the cell will have what we call the endoplasmic reticulum. And a cell has two types of endoplasmic reticulum. You have one type that's called the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and we have another part that we call the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Now, the reason why we call the rough endoplasmic reticulum rough is because all those ribosomes that are attached to it make it look like it has a really rough appearance to it. So, the rough endoplasmic reticulum has ribosomes attached to it. What's the function of the rough endoplasmic reticulum? This is a place where proteins are made. Now, the rough ER itself does not make the proteins. The ribosomes that are attached to the rough ER, that's actually what's going to make the proteins. But the purpose of the rough ER is it's going to make proteins that the cell will then ship out. So let me give you an example. Everybody's heard about insulin. Insulin is a protein. It's one diabetics can't make. Every bit of insulin you've ever made is made in your pancreas, which is right here. Cells in your pancreas make that insulin, and then they ship it out into your blood where it can go anywhere in your body. So insulin is made inside of the rough endoplasmic reticulum because this is a protein you are going to ship out so it can be used in different parts of the body. All right, so when we're talking about the rough endoplasmic reticulum, we mentioned the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, so we better talk about that now. So the rough ER is involved in making proteins, and it looks rough because it has ribosomes attached to it. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum looks smooth because there are no ribosomes attached to the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Now, even though it doesn't have ribosomes, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum does some important things, and if it wasn't for it, you would die. The two main functions of the smooth ER, and there's lots of functions of the smooth ER, but we're just going to talk about two in this class, is number one, the smooth ER makes fat. This is where carbohydrate is converted into lipid. So if you put on some weight over Christmas break, you can blame your smooth ER for that, because your smooth ER is where the fat is made that puts a little extra junk in your trunk. All fat is made in the smooth ER. That's function one. Other function of the smooth ER is it gets rid of things you don't want. Things like drugs and poisons, things that are in your body that could kill you. The smooth ER can get rid of it. Inside the smooth ER are enzymes which can break down certain toxins and poisons in your body and get rid of them. A great example of that is alcohol. Alcohol kills cells. Put some cells in alcohol, they die. So why is it someone doesn't die when they drink a beer? That's because the smooth ER inside of their cells takes that alcohol and using very specific enzymes, it gets rid of the alcohol. It wipes it out so it's not there anymore. So that's what the smooth ER does, is it gets rid of drugs and poisons. Now there's a limit to how fast the smooth ER can get rid of stuff, and this is how some things can still kill you, some poisons can still kill you, as a poison kills you faster than the smooth ER can get rid of it. So the main functions of the smooth ER: make fat, get rid of toxins, get rid of drugs and things your cells don't want. All right, next one we need to talk about is we need to talk about the Golgi body. The Golgi body, named after an Italian dude who discovered it. I always think they look like cow pies. If you look at the Golgi body, here is a picture of a Golgi body taken with an electron microscope. Now, the function of the Golgi body is you always find the Golgi body, and it is usually hanging out really close to the rough ER because the function of the Golgi body and the rough ER are very closely related. What the Golgi body does is it packages proteins that are made in the rough ER so they can be shipped in the blood. So here we have the rough ER, and this rough ER is going to make a protein. And this protein, after it's been made, is going to go to the Golgi body. And the Golgi body is going to put a special package on that protein and then send it out of the cell so it can then travel through the blood. Some of the proteins that your body makes are what's called hydrophobic. They don't mix well with blood, and your blood is predominantly water. Well, if you take something like oil and put it in water, it doesn't mix very well. This is how many of your proteins react when they touch water, is the same way oil does. It doesn't want to mix with it. Well, what the Golgi body does is it puts that protein, here you can see the proteins inside of a package, and then they can travel inside the blood freely and get to where they need to do. So that's the main job of the Golgi body. I think of it as being like the UPS store. The UPS store, people take crap and they put it into packages so they can be mailed off. That's pretty much what the Golgi body does. The endoplasmic reticulum makes the protein, the Golgi body then packages it so it can be sent out of the cell. All right, the next part of the cell we need to talk about is, let's talk about the chloroplast. Here what you can see is you can see some plant cells, and inside these plant cells you see these little green circles or discs. Those are the chloroplasts. Those are the chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are green. They're found inside of plant cells. And the function of the chloroplast is this is where photosynthesis happens. Photosynthesis is a process of how plants take carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water, and they use that to make their food. They use that to make carbohydrates. Well, all photosynthesis happens inside of the chloroplast, predominantly plant cells, and that's something to bring up. Chloroplasts are only found in plant cells. You don't find chloroplasts in animal cells, you don't find them in fungi cells, you sure as heck don't find them in prokaryote cells. Chloroplasts are only found in plant cells where photosynthesis can happen. Now, one thing about the chloroplast is there's a couple of different regions of the chloroplast that knowing these will be important when we talk about photosynthesis. There are two different regions of the chloroplast, and the two regions is, number one, you have what's called the thylakoids. Inside of the chloroplast, you're going to find these discs that are stacked on top of each other, like a stack of pennies or something like that. These discs that are stacked together are called the thylakoids, and in the thylakoids is where much of photosynthesis happens. Now, the thylakoids do not take up all the space inside of the chloroplast. The parts of the chloroplast that are not thylakoid we call the stroma. And the stroma is this fluid that fills the inside of the chloroplast. And this fluid called the stroma is also going to be involved in photosynthesis. So for now, main thing you need to know is the chloroplast is where photosynthesis happens. You only find them in plants. And there are two regions of the chloroplast, the thylakoid and the stroma. That will be important when we talk about photosynthesis later. Next part of the cell we're going to talk about is, let's talk about the mitochondria. Let's talk about the mitochondria. Here's an electron microscope picture taken of a mitochondria. Best description I've heard is it kind of looks like a footprint, is what the mitochondria looks like. Now, the function of the mitochondria, your middle school teacher may have told you this is the powerhouse of the cell. This is where, the cell gets its energy from. That's pretty close. What happens is inside of the mitochondria, a process called cellular respiration happens. And cellular respiration is how your body takes and breaks your food apart and uses the energy in your food to make this thing that's called ATP. And then your cell uses the ATP for energy. So the mitochondria is where ATP is made, and ATP is what is used by all of your cells for energy. So the mitochondria is where energy is produced in the form of ATP. Now, one thing to get out of your head right now, Some students get messed up and they think, well, plant cells have chloroplasts and animal cells have mitochondria. Wrong. Every eukaryote cell on the planet has mitochondria. You find mitochondria in every cell except for prokaryotes. Prokaryotes do not have mitochondria, but every eukaryote cell does. Now, just like the chloroplast had a couple of regions, the thylakoid and the stroma. The mitochondria has the same thing. I'm just going to mention them now, and then we'll talk about them more when I teach you cellular respiration in about a month. But the structure of the mitochondria is there's a couple of different things we need to talk about. The mitochondria actually has two membranes. It has its own membrane, kind of like a cell membrane, which we call the outer membrane, and then inside of that, there's a second membrane, which we call the cristae. The cristae, which is the second membrane, which is inside the mitochondria. And then inside of the cristae, we have something that we call the matrix. No, we're not talking about the movies. Inside of the cristae is the matrix. So those are two regions of the mitochondria. You're going to want to remember those when we talk about cellular respiration in about a month. Earlier in the class, I taught you about enzymes. And I taught you about how enzymes make things and break things. And inside of your cells, some of your cells have enzymes that they need to have to break things. Well, the problem with enzymes is where they break stuff, you don't want them to break the wrong thing. And that's where our next organelle comes in, which is called the lysosome. Here, what you're looking at here is this is a picture of a white blood cell called an eosinophil. And you see all those red dots inside of it? Those are the lysosomes of the eosinophil. And inside of each of these red dots are lots and lots of enzymes that will break stuff apart. So the function of the lysosome is they store catabolic enzymes. Enzymes that will break stuff apart are found in the lysosomes. We keep them in there so they're not damaging parts of the cell that we don't want them to, but we want to keep these enzymes ready to go to break things apart that need to be broken apart. One of the things that your cell needs to break apart is old cell parts, and we call this autophagy. Your cell recycles stuff all the time. If you have a mitochondria that is malfunctioning, what the cell will actually do is it'll take a lysosome, and the lysosome will break that mitochondria down to its very basic parts, and then the cell can take those parts, put them together again, and make a new mitochondria. So that's one of the things that lysosomes are used for, is recycling of old parts of the cell so they can be broken apart and used to make new parts of the cell. The next organelle we need to talk about is involved in storage, and that would be the vacuole. The vacuole is a part of the cell that stores food, water, and waste for the cell. It gets its name because vacuoles were first discovered in plant cells, and the people saw that water was getting sucked into the vacuole, so that's where the term comes from. It kind of sounds like vacuum. Now, there are a few main types of vacuoles, okay? The first one we're going to talk about is the central vacuole. This is something that is only found in plant cells. Plant cells have one big vacuole. It's a central vacuole. Here you can see this picture. Here you can see a plant cell with a nucleus, a cell wall, and all that fun stuff. And then this big space right here, that's a central vacuole. And it's there to store water. Makes sense. Plants need to store a lot of water. Other type of vacuole we talk about is the food vacuole. Food vacuoles are mainly found in animal cells. And what it's there for is a cell will take a piece of food, put it inside a vacuole so that enzymes can break it apart so that the cell can use those pieces of food. Now, vacuoles is one of the big places where plant cells and animal cells are different from each other. Plants have a cell wall, animals don't. Plants have chloroplasts, animals don't. Plants have one big vacuole, animals have bunches of little vacuoles. So both plants and animals have vacuoles, but plants have a great big one, animal cells have a bunch of little ones. Last organelle, hooray! Last one we need to talk about is we need to talk about the cytoskeleton. Inside of cells, there are a bunch of proteins that stretch from one end of the cell to the other, kind of like a rope. So if you want to picture what the cytoskeleton's like, imagine a room that has ropes that are tied from one end of the room to the other end of the room. That's what the cytoskeleton is, but the cytoskeleton is made out of proteins. These green things you see right here, those are the different parts of the cytoskeleton, and all of this is made out of protein. Now the function of the cytoskeleton is it holds the cell in its shape, and it's used for moving things around in the cell. That these proteins that make up the cytoskeleton are the same thing that make up your muscles. And muscle proteins can move just like these proteins that make up the cytoskeleton can move too. So that allows the cell to move things around inside of the cell is by attaching them to these proteins here that are part of the cytoskeleton. Other things that are used, cytoskeleton's used for is it's used to separate chromosomes during cell division. We'll talk about that when we hit mitosis. Allows the cell to move. Cells that can move because of their cytoskeleton. And then the cytoskeleton can also be used to bring things inside the cell. Let me give you an example. This is a white blood cell, and this thing here, it is grabbing. Oh, sorry, I'm in the way. You saw that the white blood cell moved and it grabbed a hold of something and brought it inside the cell. That was because of the cytoskeleton. All right, so now that we've talked about all the different parts of the cell, now let's go back and let's review what types of cells have which of these parts. So first off, let's talk about prokaryotes, the simplest ones, bacteria. Prokaryotes are found to have cell walls, cell membrane, ribosomes, and DNA. That's it. Those are the only parts of the cell you'll ever find in a prokaryote. Done. End of discussion. Next one, let's talk about our eukaryotes, and not all eukaryotes have the same parts to them. So first off, let's talk about a eukaryote animal cell. So any animal cell, this is what you're going to find. Cell membrane, ribosomes, DNA, smooth and rough ER, mitochondria, lysosome, Golgi body, nucleus, and vacuoles. And then of course with the nucleus you're going to have the nuclear membrane and nucleolus. So those are the parts that you're going to find in an animal cell. In a plant cell, you're going to find everything that's in an animal cell plus a chloroplast and a cell wall. So a plant cell has everything that an animal cell has plus two more things. In a fungus cell, what you're going to find is you're going to find everything that you found in an animal cell plus a cell wall. No chloroplasts though. Chloroplasts are only found in plant cells. So these are all the different parts of the cell that we covered, and you do need to know the function of each and every one of them.